that we have, of course, foolishness that is a spiritual foolishness below intellect. And in order to be able to create the Mishkan, create the tabernacle, part of the job is to turn over the foolishness of the world into the foolishness of holiness. And we haven't really discussed what that means. Here he's going to give a very, very practical side of it. And we're going to finish off this mimer with this idea. And next time we're going to
for some reason.
So Rabbi, we're finishing up on chapter 5. Is that the idea?
Yes.
It's not.
Okay, thank you.
Gemara share. It's considered this year. It's usually Wednesday and Friday, but for whatever reason they changed it.
Yeah. So I apologize again. So we've got basically this concept of foolishness of the in the world in general that needs to be turned over to shtus, foolishness of holiness. In other words, basically to go from below logic to above logic, to be able to transcend instead of just being limited and stuck in the worldly limitations. So I introduced this mimer by saying that this really created the pathway forward for Chabad. When we look at it as normal people, I guess, it's very difficult to see exactly where things were moving. And the previous Rebbe gives an individualistic approach here, how to apply this concept, which we're going to see over here. But the Rebbe took a different take on it. The Rebbe took it into a global direction. Because there are certain things that when we think about it, we realize that they're actually foolish. And I'll give you an example. My father is a writer, and for a significant amount of his career as a writer, he worked for advertising agencies and marketing. And I once asked him, I said, he did an advertising, he did an ad campaign for a shoe that was a walking shoe. And I once asked him, I said, why don't you ever do something for like these big companies like Nike or something like that? And the gist of what he said was, those advertising campaigns are not true. Nike wants you to think that if I put on my shoes, Nike shoes, I can be like Mike. I can be like Michael Jordan. I can jump as high as he can. I can do moves like he can. And that's their entire focus of their marketing campaign. What I like to present, he said, as an advertiser, is intellectually, basically, what's the value of my product, as opposed to lying to people and telling people that if you do this, you will be that. And you see the vast majority of Madison Avenue marketing and advertising is lies. And so it's very easy to look at anything like that and just cast it all in the same basket and say, okay, this is just all completely false. But the Rebbe was able to zero in on something that was important, and that was the concept of marketing itself. And this is just an example, that the marketing itself can be used for godliness. Marketing itself can be something that can be turned around from something that is shtus, foolishness of this world, and it can be turned into something that is godly. And that's just one example of many, many, many. And that's basically when you see what Chabad has done versus everybody else in the entire Jewish world, you can see that it's based on this idea that just because something exists in the world does not mean that it's bad. In fact, you have to reach into it and find a way to be able to reveal that it's good. And Chabad got a tremendous amount of flack over the years for every single one of its campaigns. From the Orthodox world, from the non-Orthodox world, from everybody. What are they doing? They're crazy. I grew up in the 80s, and I remember I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, which is not a big Chabad community at all. There were maybe 4 Chabad families at a type, and many non-Chabad. And I remember as a kid, even though I wasn't, our family wasn't, shall we say, hardcore, I remember feeling the pressure of kids around me saying that, oh, Chabad is crazy, Chabad is crazy. Because the approach was so radical, was so different. But I'd like to submit that a tremendous amount of the effort in the Chabad world was driven by this mimer, driven by this concept, and the Rebbe drove it that way, because otherwise what we're going to see right here, which is very individualistic, that would be it. It would just be a very individual perspective. And we'll continue that conversation as we finish the mimer. Now, so we're up to the 3 stars, I believe. And the Rebbe says, having now understood that the 2 levels of foolishness, of folly, we can now revert to the explanation why the Mishkan had to be built specifically of acacia wood. Shitim, Atzei Shitim. Sorry. I stated above, the intent of the divine service in the Mishkan was to transform darkness into light to the degree where the darkness itself would be luminous, to transform the spirit of foolishness that stems from the other side into the foolishness of holiness. The Mishkan was therefore made of acacia wood, whose name in Hebrew echoes the word for folly shtus, for it is thus embodied the principle that conduct, which is folly in the sense that is lower than reason, ought to be transformed into conduct which is folly in the sense that it transcends reason. Now we go back into the original conversation in the very first chapter. We may now more fully appreciate the teaching, and they shall make a sanctuary, and I shall dwell within them. Vasu li mikdash v'shachanti bitocham, and we said bitocham means within each and every single individual. God dwells within each individual through his divine service of personal refinement, which transforms darkness into light, and through his efforts at turning the sub-rational elements of the world into the super-rational. When we go through our world and we recognize that there are elements in our lives that need to be turned into super-rational, something that is logical and systematic is limiting. Something that is logical and systematic is important for the majority of our service of God. We're not saying that a person should be totally nuts. And in fact, there was a group of Hasidim who were students of the Maggid of Mezrich, and their approach began to be that, basically the world can go jump off a cliff. And as, in order to be able to express that, they used to do crazy things. They used to do somersaults in the streets. They used to go dance with the mailman. They used to do all sorts of things that people thought were nuts. And this created a very bad taste in the community and in the non-Jewish community as well. And they got a lot of flack. This happened in the year of 5530, which was the Hebrew letters Taf Kuf Lamed. And This group was led by a charismatic rabbi who was friendly with the Alter Rebbe by the name of Rabbi Avram of Kalisk, the Kalisker direction. Eventually, Rabbi Avram of Kalisk moved to Israel. But Chassidim used to say, Tolk is nicht kein Tolk. This approach that he taught in this year of 5530 is not the right way. It's not the way things should be directed. Total and absolute craziness is not what we're talking about. We're talking about recognizing that pure limitation is itself limiting. And there are certain elements of life that we need to transcend. And here I'll give a perfect example. On a practical level, there are things that people do only because everyone does them. Certain folkways that are conventionally held to be proper. For example, crystallize into unalterable laws. Such unreasonable habits ought to be transformed through one's own endeavors. Instead of remaining below reason, they should be elevated above reason. And now he gives an example. Business commitments, for example, pressing as they may be, do not generally overrule the time that convention prescribes for eating and sleeping. They do, however, sometimes set aside or even cancel the fixed times that should be regularly scheduled for Torah study and prayer. So, whatever's going on, we need to stop for lunch. Whatever's going on, we have dinner time. And again, this is talking in the 40s when this, the world was far more structured than it is right now. So I don't know if this is truly the exact same thing as it is nowadays. But the concept is certainly still applicable. That there are certain things that people just do. That's what people do. And so he's saying is that lunch comes at all costs, but Torah study and prayer does not. Logically, you would think, of course, that the business concerns are more important than lunch. But, it's lunch, it's tea time in England, and we need to stop. And that's very illogical. So the Rebbe says, how do you transform that into that idea of basically, okay, I need to stop everything because it's lunchtime now and it's 12 o'clock and there's nothing else that can, or it's 2 o'clock, it's tea time and nothing else is going to stop me right now. I need to take my break. So the Rebbe says that you can take that exact attitude and apply it into Judaism. And the Rebbe explains, a man who feels accountable to his soul should ask himself, is there any wisdom in such conduct? For who is the man who knows when his time will come? How then can a man expend his soul's energy on goals that have no substance and utterly forget the purpose for which his soul descended into the world? Let him realize that this possibility only comes from the spirit of foolishness which he was given to elevate and transform. With that realization, he will stand fast and fix times for the study of Torah. And then I will develop within each one of them, divine light will be revealed within his soul and illuminate it. So instead of taking the idea that lunchtime is immutable, tea time is immutable, I cannot change tea time, a person should apply that same idea to Torah study. I cannot allow anything to get into the way of my Torah study, of my prayer. And this time is not time in which anything else can exist. The Rebbe told Shluchim that during their study of Torah, they should consider their phone as if their phone should be muktzah, as if it's Shabbat and you're not allowed to touch the phone. That's it. The phone doesn't exist. Of course, that instruction is even more difficult nowadays than ever before. Because nowadays we have it pulling at us from every corner. Back in the day, you had one phone in the house, and that was that. But we need to apply this foolishness of tea time, so to speak, into our own lives in such a way. And likewise, the same thing with regards to any other system in the world that basically, why do people do it this way? Well, that's what happens. We need to find something, some element of it that we can take and apply into our own Judaism. So like we said, this concept, the previous Rebbe explains it very individualistically. And the Rebbe took it much bigger. And he took a long time. When the Rebbe first became Rebbe, he wasn't speaking to a very big crowd. Because again, you got to put yourself back in that space of 1950, 1951. The majority of Chabad was either stuck behind the Iron Curtain, or they were still trying to get out of DP camps, or they had moved from DP camps into France. Many of them had moved to Israel. And the amount of people that you had in the United States proper was really, we're talking a very small group of people. Everybody's frozen here. There we go. Okay. I was talking to one of the somebody who has memories from those times. We were driving together for an hour, and he started telling me the memories, and he told me that the Rebbe was speaking in the small shul upstairs, which is basically not bigger than my dining room here. And he described it. He said the Bachrim, the unmarried boys, stood at the left. The married men stood at the right. And in front of the Rebbe, there was the table with the children. And when I heard those words, the table with the children, it really, really struck me. Because, you think of Chabad, and you think of a huge amount of people. And I said, the table? He said, yeah. How many children were there, in those years? 10, 12? There were not that many families. And so this kind of revision of what was going on made me realize how extraordinary it was that the Rebbe was speaking to these people in this kind of way. The Rebbe speaking to the people in terms of taking over the world, in terms of Judaism, in terms of spreading Judaism throughout the world, in terms of bringing people close. And he's speaking to 60, 70 people. And as we're talking about it, I said to him, I think that I have new appreciation for the Rebbe's patience, because it took maybe 20 years before people really started understanding what the Rebbe was talking about. Now everybody here is frozen. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we're fine. We're not frozen. It's your side.
Okay, let me see. Try to move closer to the router. I don't know why it's.
When you're moving now, your camera is, in any case, with you.
Good. But you've heard me until now?
Absolutely. Yes,
We're fine.
We're fine. Relax.
Okay.
Yeah. Drink a little more coffee. Go ahead.
If we didn't hear you, believe me, I would be complaining.
Kashrying is the word. Shrying.
And I forgot my mimer. Hang on a second. Let me get that.
Thank you, Robert.
Hey, it's only complimentary. It's only complimentary.
I didn't want to say the wrong thing.
It's okay.
So the Rebbe is talking to people, and he's telling him these huge ideas, and it really took years, and we're talking about decades before it really became commonplace. He was working with the younger guys. The older guys really thought that he was talking about spiritual matters alone. And the younger boys, as they started growing up, they started applying these things. And that's where Chabad started growing. People, of course, heard of the Rebbe. They heard of his wisdom and they were coming to meet him. And so the influence was growing. But until Chabad really, really started sending people out in mass, it really didn't start taking off until the 70s. There's a tremendous amount of work in Israel itself. But you talk about Israel. The Rebbe was really upset. I saw a couple letters from the Rebbe recently during the Suez campaign. The Rebbe was really upset at the Chassidim in Israel for not encouraging people more and not going out and being more involved. And the Chassidim, and of course, in 1956, you're talking about the Chassidim in Israel. These people they're all Holocaust survivors or Stalinist survivors. And here was a war going on. And the Rebbe's saying, no, people need you to pick yourselves up. And you need to encourage people. You need to invigorate people. Specifically at this time, this is the best time to be able to do it because this is when people need you. And people didn't understand that. Come to the 6-Day War, at that point, people had really begun to absorb it more. And especially the fear was so palpable as opposed to the Suez Canal. It was not nearly as palpable as it was prior to the 6-Day War. And the Rebbe was being the only person to stand up in public. This is videoed. You can go online and watch it, like B'Omer of 1967, where the Rebbe stood up in public and said that Israel's on the verge of a great victory, and it's through specifically through the mitzvah of tefillin that we're going to accomplish this victory. And he was the only person saying this. And so then that's when Hasidim started doing things that was really, shall we say, illogical. They started going out and asking for tefillin. Now, here's the interesting thing about this historically. The rabbis of the yeshiva taught the boys, the teenagers, and the rabbinical students. The rabbis taught them that what the Rebbe means is that when you put on tefillin, you should intellectually think about those who are not putting on tefillin, and as a result, that spiritual energy will influence somebody else to put on tefillin. And the boys said, no, that's not what the Rebbe said. The Rebbe said I should go out on the street and put tefillin on people. And so the way the tefillin campaign started was actually in New York. The boys would go to a shul, and they would stand outside of a shul, and they would say, Atzenter, which of course those of you who speak Yiddish know it means a 10th man. In those years, almost everybody spoke Yiddish, and somebody would come in and say, you need a 10th man. They'd pull him into the shul, and they'd say, no, we actually don't need a 10th guy. We want you to put on tefillin. So that was how that, but again, there was a more connected reality. My grandfather had tefillin. He rarely put them on, to the extent that when my mother got married, the first day after they got married, my father put on talis and tefillin. My mother was like, what the heck is going on? She had never seen this before. She had seen my grandfather's tefillin, her father's tefillin in the closet, and she thought that was some kind of radio receiver or something like that. So there was, again, the disconnect was not nearly as stark as it is right now at that point, and therefore that was the way they started doing things. But at some point they realized that there's only a certain amount of people that you can drag into the shul. You know what they say? It's a funny term to use in this context. Basically, if Muhammad ain't coming to the mountain, bring the mountain to Muhammad. And that's exactly what the boys started doing. These teenagers, they took something that was quote unquote foolish, in terms of street peddling and that kind of thing, and they turned it over to Judaism. And that's exactly what the Rebbe wanted. They took something that was illogical, conceptually, didn't make any sense, and they applying it to their Judaism. That's how the Tefillin campaign began. And that was the first of the later major campaigns. So this idea, like I said, here the previous Rebbe describes it very, very personally, but the Rebbe transformed it into something much global. So finally, in terms of this first mimer of the series, this is the meaning of the above quoted statement of the Zohar. When the Sitra Achra is subdued, when the foolishness of the animal soul and the excitement of worldly pleasures have been transformed into holiness through the fulfillment of Torah mitzvos, then the glory of God rises thereby and is diffused throughout all the world. The ascendant light of Soviv Kalaman will shine forth in lustrous revelation that the way to be able to accomplish this great revelation in this world happens, and that, of course, will occur in the Messianic times as a result of us taking the world itself and turning it over to godliness, taking even the foolishness, the things that are sub-rational, the things that don't make sense, and figure out some way to be able to draw it into holiness. That process is part of the process of the end process of bringing Mashiach into this world. So this is the end of the first Maimer of Basi Lgani. There are another 4 Maimarim that continue as what's called a hemshech, a continuation. We're not going to go through all 4 because they meander, so to speak. And I do want to get over to a Maimer that is a Maimer that deals with Purim, and then afterwards to go to Pesach. So what I did was I went through those subsequent 4 Maimarim, and I isolated the chapters that continue this theme specifically, so that we can see a little bit more of the continuation of this idea, where the previous Rebbe expands this idea much further. Like I said, the entire thing is available on Chabad.org, so you can read every one of the Maimarim. But we have another 3 or 4 chapters that I'm going to send out to Rabbi Smith today, and I just need to go through it to make sure that it's smooth, and that will continue this subject, this idea. And we're going to talk about the fact that Atzei Shitim, this idea of foolishness, that specifically makes up the beams. The beams in the Hebrew is the word keresh. And keresh is the exact same letters as the word sheker, falsehood. So it continues this idea and brings it out even further by showing us that the very, very basis of what we need to do and the breakdown of the falsehood of the world is really to turn that falsehood into the beams themselves for Judaism. We'll talk about how that idea, I think, very much applies to what's going on nowadays. So that's what's coming up, God willing, in the next few weeks. I'll send out the next document to Rabbi Smith soon. And any questions before I hand it over to Rabbi Smith?
Rabbi, I think
Yes.
in Hebrew, keresh is a board. Korah
Yes.
is
Yeah.
a beam.
Yes, that's correct. In the Mishkan, the term that's used to describe these beams that held the Mishkan together, they are referred to as Kerash.
Okay.
So modern Hebrew, yes, Torah, but in the biblical Hebrew, the term keresh is to describe the beams, and also that's going to be it. So to be continued. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful day. We will study again tomorrow because the end of my week is completely booked up. We've got a military conference that we're putting on. So with that, I hand it over to Rabbi Smith.